Marx has suggested that part of the human condition is the feeling of alienation, alienation from nature, alienation from our work. But perhaps there's something more to that. In Edward Said's Orientalism, we can see how the West uses the Orient, the East, as an empty signifier that we project onto all the mysteries of the world. The same issue applies today, where the indigenous is quickly becoming the new empty signifier, the new Orient. I'm not suggesting that we do not engage in the wisdom and the teachings of the indigenous or the Orient or any of the other, but rather we should examine it closely. We should learn the understanding of the language within itself as opposed to relying on cheap translations. As the section continues with the Shengren or Oriental sage, there's a quote from Mengzi. And again, the Latin translation goes to Mencius. Mengzi, and this is the name here. Mengzi was alive during the warring periods, which is around 475 to 221 BCE. And here, even the way that we conceptualize time is very important to understand on whose time. We, of course, no longer use the Christian domination of AD, Anno Domini, after Christ, or BC, before Christ. And we now use Common Era or before Common Era. But common for who? So Mengzi was from the warring period, which is from 475 to 221 BCE. And he himself was from around 372 to 289 BCE and was a follower of Kongzi or Confucius. Bo among the sages was the pure one. Yin among the sages was one of the most inclined to take office. Hui of Liuxia among the sages was the accommodating one. And Confucius among the sages was the timorous one. In Confucius, we have what is called a complete concert. A complete concert is when the large bell proclaims the commencement of the music and the ringing stone proclaims its close. The metal sound commences the blended harmony of all the instruments, and the winding up with the stone terminates that blended harmony. The commencing that harmony is the work of wisdom. The terminating that harmony is the work of sageness. As a comparison for wisdom, we may liken it to skill, and as compassion for sages, we may liken it to strength, as in the case of shooting at a mark 100 paces distant, that you reach it owing to your strength, but that you hit the mark is not owing to your strength. And to provide just a little bit of a backdrop of some of these people that Mencius refers to, first is Bo, which is from the 11 BCE, from the Shang Cao, the Shang dynasty, which is the Bronze Era, and also Yin, from the 1600 to the 1400 BCE, and later Liu Xiahui, from 771 BCE, which is from the Chunqiu dynasty, the Spring-Autumn dynasty. So remember back to when we spoke about the introduction of philosophy, Western philosophy. It seems to be that almost thought and wisdom only started with Socrates, and even more so with Christianity. Of course, with the Christian traditions, we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. And so how do we relate to the period before Christ? Are they simply a group of undeveloped, uncultured beings with nothing to teach us? Can wisdom be seen as an orchestration? This is the concept that we're brought to question. So for a composition, just as in music, we can consider the composer or the conductor. And so Mencius is proposing the idea that wisdom or sagacity, we could look at as a composer of harmony. And under Confucianism and Buddhism as well, and even Taoism, what is harmony? One of the ideals is to search for self-cultivation. Self-cultivation under Confucius teachings, we look at filial piety, ancestor worship, love of learning, spiritual teaching, mind and body practices, awareness of oneness, and the balance and harmony. These are all the instruments in which one needs to cultivate and harmonize together. This is all part of what it means for self-cultivation. This is what it means to have an ideal personality, which is associated to the concept of Jinzi. And let's contrast that back to Christianity, where man was created by God. In Confucianism, man was part of the universe. There's a concept called 天人合一, oneness of heaven and man is the English translation. But again, we must remember that in English we use gendered words such as man for all people. But in Chinese, the man or human actually does not denote man or woman. There is no gendered ideal in the language itself. And furthermore, this idea of heaven, everything under heaven. There's another word, 天下, means heaven or sky, and under, that means the world. That includes everything. So there's an ideal to search for oneness with everything. Therefore, ultimately becoming a Shengren is the cultivation of the self. And I quote here, it was a teaching about goodness, humility, social conduct, benevolence, and true humanity. Translating Sheng as English wise man never occurred, and if it should occur one day, it ought to be considered dull and unimaginative. Sagacity and wisdom are not the same. Translating Shengren as German der Weise, which more or less corresponded to English wise man, was philologically speaking acceptable but a bit unfortunate, since the Weise translation would always resonate with bedtime stories which made China look immature. German der stoische Weise, the Stoic wise man, was as unsuitable for Confucius because it denoted a Greek concept. The particular Stoic sage, not just any sage, and biased because it produced that certain negative sensation of hapless fools and quacks who allegedly possessed eternal Glückseligkeit. Even Arthur Schopenhauer, the spiritual philosopher and supporter of Buddhist thought, once accused the Stoic sages of Greece of their total passivity and disregard for human nature. Stoicism was a school of Hellenistic thought founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, although the Stoic tradition was unaffected by the collapse of the Roman Empire. Stoicism was dissolved in Europe in the 6th century by order of Emperor Justinian I. And a personification of wisdom or sagacity, something that all sages had in common, had now become redundant and obsolete in a world dominated by that heavenly ruler, where highest wisdom was the God alone and the truth became unattainable. It could only be loved, philo, and hoped for, like a never-ending treasure hunt. Those who spread the word of God were called saints. In German, Heilige, the servants of the divine. Divine in Chinese is Shen. It is unrelated to Sheng. With saints guarding the European soul against secular competitors, plain sages, including the Stoic ones, became society's outcasts. Reading through this, I thought of the word idiot. The etymology of idiot comes from the Greek word idiotes, which is referring to somebody that is not involved in public affairs, somebody who is ignorant. And in a way, our modern times, we have given up a lot of our own agency into a system where we're hoping will take care of everything for us, thus rendering ourselves to become all idiots. The quote, "You will own nothing and you will be happy." Going beyond just a question of ownership in material things, we have also given up the ability to take ownership of our mind and also of our communities. I'd like to refer for a moment to the painting by Michelangelo from 1512, The Creation of Adam, which is currently at the Sistine Chapel. This is an important painting to think back in terms of how the West conceptualizes oneself with regard to God or the world or wisdom. And how does this transform over the last 500 years into secularism? How do we relate to knowledge and wisdom? Remember as well that this painting was done in the year 1512. And let's examine what else was happening in the world during that time. This was a time right before the colonization of the Americas, the upcoming genocide of the indigenous people, of the civilization of the Incas. Yet, for the West, it is conceptualized as the peak of civilization, where man almost touches God within this painting. Right, the longing for sages and Eastern spirituality was skillfully described in a poem by William Butler Yeats, Sailing to Byzantium. Yeats lamented that Europe neglected its unaged intellect, its old people and their spiritual wisdom. Old men were dying in solitude and loneliness, while the youth were in one another's arms. Yeats' poetic self decided to leave that no country for old men behind and set out on a spiritual journey that would bring him to the holy city of Byzantium, also known as Constantinople, where Yeats longed to find the sages. It's the quote from the poem. That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song, the salmon falls, the mackerel crowded seas, fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long. Whatever is begotten, born and dies, caught in that sensual music, all neglect. Monuments of unaging intellect. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing. For every tatter in its mortal dress, nor is there singing school but studying, monument of its own magnificence, and therefore I have sailed the seas and come to the holy city of Byzantium. This poem was written in 1928, and Dr. Pattberg reminds us that not everybody felt such great nostalgia for the sages of the East, of course. The reality was that the encounter of the East and West during each time was very often different from shallow poetic sympathy. The British imperialists showed contempt for the perceived idleness, arrogance, and uselessness of Oriental sages. Quote, I suppose a true Eastern sage would say that the working government which we, the British, have taken upon ourselves in Egypt is the dirty work, the inferior work of carrying out the necessary labor. They found resonance in the continental Europe. The German world historian Oswald Spengler called the sages lazy, bequem, and the teaching spiritual egoism, geistiger Egoismus. The German philosopher Hegel deemed the entire system of Chinese thought a shallow fantasy that was untrue and inherently inconsistent. What are some of the symptoms of linguistic imperialism? We can see from the last 100 years, especially from what happened with the conquest of Africa, but also the colonialism of the last 400 years. What kind of foundation and logic enabled the West to impose themselves upon the world? And again, I think it's so important to constantly bring all of this into consideration to what is happening today. As we step closer and closer to the repetition of the dates prior to World War I and World War II, as we see Israel moving into Lebanon, expanding the war into potentially with Iran. What is the logic behind all of this? Who are the other that does not deem the respect of being human, that are treated like dogs and animals? What is the logic behind this expansionism?